All right, I guess we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for showing up today, and welcome to NBR's event on securing South Korea's digital infrastructure in the AI era. I'm Doug Strube, Senior Director for Research and Programs at the National Bureau of Asian Research, and we're really excited to be hosting this event today as it really intersects with a number of research projects we have going on. One of these is a multi-year project with the State Department's Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital Policy, who you'll be hearing from in a few minutes, looking at global approaches to cybersecurity policy, development, and implementation. And part of that project looks at the intersection of artificial intelligence and cybersecurity, which is a topic that will come up today, looking at both the risks emerging from AI-enabled cyber attacks, as well as the emergence of AI-powered cyber defense tools. Another project we have going on is looking at the evolution of AI governance and regulation in the Indo-Pacific. And that's looking at a number of country perspectives, how different countries in the region are developing their AI policies and regulations, and also kind of touches on some of the themes of today's conversation. And then finally, we have an ongoing multi-year initiative examining Indo-Pacific digital regulation and business environments, and the implications for innovation, investment, and trade. And the first year of that project looked specifically at South Korea and some of their digital platform and competition policies, and kind of how that interacted with the foreign business community and the impacts of that on South Korea's own domestic and innovation environment. We have some hubs for some of these out on the table, so I encourage you to look at them. And a lot of this work has really looked at the US-ROK alliance and finds that achieving cyber resilience requires both the cooperation and the adoption of trusted, secure AI systems, which will be a conversation taking place today. And we really believe that the US and Korea are well positioned to capitalize on this, given the strength of the relationship and kind of how it's evolved from its longstanding focus on traditional security issues to more of a tech and innovation cooperation focus. And this has included things like the establishment of the US-ROK cyber policy consultations and last year's US-ROK technology prosperity deal, which emphasizes alignment of AI policy frameworks and the acceleration of AI adoption. So South Korea has taken numerous steps to implement AI-enabled cyber capacities, but challenges remain, and that'll really be a theme of today's discussion. Requirements around data localization, network separation, and certification processes to provide cloud services to public institutions can act as barriers for the most advanced companies in the world to do business in South Korea and help them really access gold standard AI capabilities. So we have a great set of panelists today, who my colleague Jonathan Merrick, our Assistant Director for Technology and Geoeconomic Affairs, will introduce shortly. But first, I want to introduce our featured speaker, Russ Headlee, Senior Bureau Official for the US Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital Policy. Senior Official Headlee is a career Foreign Service officer, and he most recently served as Acting Chief of Staff to the Undersecretary for Economic Affairs and as a member of Secretary Rubio's policy planning staff. Previously, he served as Director for Jordan and Lebanon at the National Security Council and held positions with the Office of Macroeconomic Affairs and the Office of China Coordination. So with that, I'd like to welcome Senior Officer Headlee to the stage.
Thanks a lot, Doug, and good afternoon, everyone. As Doug mentioned, my name is Russ Headlee, and I lead the State Department's Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital Policy right now. Our Bureau leads U.S. diplomacy on a wide range of things, including critical and emerging technology and digital policy. So that's what I'm doing here. As a career diplomat, the word sovereignty is quite common in our guild, I guess, but nowhere is the word more fashionable right now or more subjective, I would argue, than in debates around technology. Sovereignty in its classical sense, and here I recognize I'm doing the thing that your high school teacher told you not to do, which is opening my essay by telling you what Webster's defines sovereignty as, is the right of an independent state to govern itself without external interference, in other words, to make its own policy choices. That principle is one that probably every nation shares, and certainly that nations like the United States and the ROK share. It's broadly not in dispute. What is in dispute is how governments are applying the term and the concept more broadly to technology and digital regulations, and whether those applications ultimately serve their people. We've watched the phrases, which I will use somewhat interchangeably through the course of these remarks, so you'll forgive me, and if it gets really confusing, just raise your hand and I'll explain what I'm doing. But we've watched the phrases digital sovereignty, tech sovereignty, and increasingly over the last year or so, AI sovereignty become a catch-all justification for a wide range of policy measures. Some of those policy measures, some of which Doug just mentioned, include unnecessarily restrictive data localization requirements, blanket restrictions on foreign cloud providers, network usage fees targeting content platforms, and procurement rules that limit government's ability to choose the most capable technology providers. In most cases, these measures do not strengthen security, national security, economic security. They do not strengthen government oversight, and they do not strengthen domestic economies, which is ostensibly the goal. What they do is raise costs, reduce competition, and critically, in many cases, they enhance security risks. What the United States cannot accept then in this area is appeals to digital sovereignty that are designed to exclude or discriminate against American companies. White House Office of Science and Technology Policy Director Michael Kratsios recently in February of this year said that, quote, real AI sovereignty means owning and using best-in-class technology for the benefit of your people. He was addressing the AI Impact Summit in India when he said this, so he was addressing a room full of global policymakers, end quote. Using the best-in-class technology, then, is what allows a nation to chart its destiny in the midst of a global transformation, the global transformation that we're in. So when many countries talk about AI sovereignty, a particularly salient form of tech sovereignty, the most expansive versions of that concept become calls for complete domestic ownership of the entire AI stack, the chips, the data, the models, and the infrastructure. The AI stack, naturally, is extraordinarily complex, and attempting to build it from scratch domestically is both prohibitively expensive and risks leaving countries behind while the technology advances rapidly elsewhere. Certainly, it is advancing rapidly in the United States. In the Republic of Korea, the rapid advancement of AI has hit barriers, including requirements for physical isolation of government servers and blanket data localization policies that, from our point of view, pose a significant risk for the ROK itself. Our position then is that digital sovereignty should mean verifiable control, not physical possession. And the global economy, indeed, has long been powered by trusted business partners, sound legal contracts, and the rule of law. So this is actually nothing new to describe. Shifting toward modernized regulations with logical server separation and cross-border data flows for low to moderate tier data would allow the ROK to harness the benefits of AI for the public sector, particularly for cyber defense, as Ted mentioned. These are priorities that are enumerated publicly in the November 2025 US ROK joint fact sheet. And nothing I'm going to say here about the ROK doesn't apply to basically every other country that we engage with, for the record. I have given a couple examples here of what real AI sovereignty is not in our definition. So let me conclude by saying what it is. Real AI sovereignty then means adopting and deploying your infrastructure, your data, your models, and your policies under your control. It also means pursuing a sovereign AI capability right now, today, which is quite critical in our view, with the rapid adoption of the best components of the technology stack available, while your national champions work to develop their own. And it means choosing partners who will actually empower rather than create new dependencies. American companies, this is true of AI companies, but it's true of American tech companies more broadly, can build large-scale independent infrastructure with secure supply chains. Indeed, no one does it better. They can enable local training and fine-tuning with linguistic and cultural adaptation that the ROK and just about every country is seeking, without embedded political content requirements or mandatory data sharing obligations to a foreign government. Your sensitive data stays within your borders, your policy choices remain your own, and that, as I said at the beginning, is how we would define sovereignty. Thanks a lot.
I could have the panelists come up to the stage. Thank you, Senior Bureau Official Headlee, for kind of really framing today's conversation. It's an important one for sure, and it comes at a very important time as we are kind of seeing the rapid spread of both AI-enabled cyber attacks, as Doug mentioned, but also AI models more broadly with implications across the tech stack. As Doug mentioned, I'm Jonathan Merrick, Assistant Director of Technology and Geoeconomic Affairs at NBR, and we're really eager to kind of convene today's event that brings together a number of programs that we've done with Nigel and many other experts from our network on different kind of topics that all really, again, are intersecting in new and exciting ways. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists. First, Nigel Corey, Director of Digital Trade and Technology Policy at Crowell Global Advisors, where his work focuses on cross-border data flows, data governance, intellectual property, and how they each relate to digital trade and the broader digital economy. He regularly provides testimony and publishes reports on these issues, including in his capacity as non-resident fellow at NBR. He's previously held positions at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and others. He's a member of the United Kingdom's International Data Transfer Expert Council and the OECD Data Free Flow with Trust Expert Community. Then we've got Chris Corneli, who's Cybersecurity Policy Lead at Google Cloud's Government Affairs and Public Policy team. In this role, he advises senior Google leaders on the regulatory landscape and builds partnerships to solve hard problems in cyber and AI. He previously worked at Bloomberg Government as an expert on US federal IT policy and acquisition, and previously also served as an analyst at Gartner. And then finally, we have Caitlin Clark, Senior Director of Cybersecurity Services at Venable. In this role, she works at the nexus of cybersecurity, emergency management, financial services, emerging technology, and foreign policy. She previously served on the National Security Council, where she led the development of defense-related cybersecurity policy and oversaw interagency and international cooperation on emerging tech and cybersecurity. She also worked for more than 10 years with FEMA, and prior to that, held cybersecurity positions in the financial services industry. So with that, I'll kind of frame the discussion with an opening question and then welcome kind of a few minutes of remarks from each of you. So as I've mentioned, as we all have mentioned, the global cyber landscape is evolving. You're seeing an increased importance of AI, of cloud services, both from a threat perspective and in terms of providing additional tools to cyber defenders. And this is having major implications globally, but then particularly in markets like Korea, where you see kind of a very complex regulatory landscape. So starting with Nigel and then heading down, just welcome a few minutes of remarks on how you're viewing this evolving landscape.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks to NBR. Appreciate the opportunity to be here for another fun and interesting and timely discussion. Having worked on digital policy now for well and truly over a decade, looking at data governance, localization, technology and cybersecurity governance, I think it's particularly interesting looking at the current context in AI and cybersecurity in terms of like how one element compounds the other. And that's most specifically the case in Korea, which has a track record of enacting restrictive digital and cyber and cloud. First order. Oh. Okay, there we go. Sorry. First failure. Okay. Korea's had an interesting approach to digital policy that sets the foundation for its potential application of AI for cybersecurity. And Korea is particularly interesting because it faces particularly intense state-sponsored cyber threats in its region. And I think what stands out to me in looking at it at the current environment is that it's always a challenge for policymakers to reform legal and regulatory settings to account for current technology. But with the pace of change in AI and its use for cyber attacks as well as cyber defense, that challenge is compounded because the need to be as close to the frontier as possible and to ensure that the deployment of these current models is as far and wide as possible, especially as it results in public services, critical infrastructure and such, is that these past missteps become even more costly and compounding because it creates a defender's capability gap in the face of adversaries that are using AI as much and as far as they can. And we have situations like in Korea where public authorities, financial services firms, critical infrastructure and others, due to laws and regulations, actually can't access and use best-in-class cybersecurity tools. Never mind the fact that they still have laws and regulations in place that prohibit their use of other best-in-class IT rules. And so, again, I just think it just exposes the gap between where countries are and having best-in-class policy frameworks in place that makes it easier for them in the current AI-driven cybersecurity context. I'll leave it at that.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for your time today. It's great to be with you. In my role at Google Cloud, I kind of sit at the center of how we're watching the global debate on cybersecurity and on digital sovereignty evolve. The debate has kind of gone through several iterations, and now we're seeing a new phase in which governments around the world are responding to the need to accelerate their defenses as new AI models are released and as these capabilities potentially diffuse around the world. You know, I think it's important to maybe scene set a little bit in the sense that the arrival of Mythos has really brought this issue to the forefront of the global public conversation. But our security teams at Google and around the tech industry have been monitoring this trend for a long time. We've been observing the advances in AI as we're developing these tools internally, but we're also looking at data points. For instance, the increase in CVEs that are reported to the US government over time. And so the tech industry has been really preparing for this day for a long time. And in fact, we've been using artificial intelligence in our own internal security platform and defenses for years now. And that includes machine learning for basic platform defenses. For instance, if you are a Gmail user, you're taking advantage of AI to filter spam. But at the same time, we're implementing agentic tools, deep scanning tools that are able to not just find vulnerabilities, but to fix them autonomously. So I think it's important when we talk about the current moment that this is a progression and that these tools are state of the art and that we want to find ways to empower defenders to protect themselves before these technologies diffuse further and they find their way into the hands of our adversaries. Google Cloud publishes a quarterly AI threat tracker in which we're providing transparency into the threat landscape, what we're seeing with our own tools, as well as what we're seeing adversaries do in terms of how they're operationalizing these tools. And we really need to underscore that it's critical that these tools are accessible. And we continue to work with policymakers in Korea, but also around the world to illustrate the importance of best practices and limiting regulatory fragmentation so that we can put these tools in the hands of defenders.
Thanks, Kristen. Let me make sure mine is working. Are we good? Okay. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for having me here today. So I come from a little bit of a different perspective from Nigel and Chris. As Jonathan read my background, I think you heard that I spent 10 years at FEMA. And a lot of people think, what the heck does a person with emergency management have anything to do with cyber policy? And I'll tell you, it's because during my time in government and at FEMA and in emergency management and on the National Security Council, one lesson that I learned over and over again is it's impossible to predict every crisis, every disruption, or every threat. What's most important is organizations that perform best are not necessarily the ones that try to eliminate every risk, but they are the ones who build systems capable of adapting with circumstances change. And that's where we are right now. Circumstances have changed. Cybersecurity and AI, speed at which data is coming at us, speed at which threat actors are able to use technologies has changed. And in that kind of environment, I really think that flexibility becomes a security capability. So this is one of the reasons why conversations around cloud and AI and cybersecurity policy matter so much, because these discussions are not simply about technology and procurement and regulatory compliance. It's about whether or not governments and organizations have the flexibility to adapt to technologies and threats as they evolve. I think the framing is particularly relevant to the current discussion in Korea, as we've talked about around network separation, cloud adoption, wealth, and what Mr. Headlee referred to as AI sovereignty. I think those debates are understandable. You know, I think every government has a legitimate interest in protecting sensitive data and maintaining national security. But from a cybersecurity perspective, I would suggest that resilience is rarely achieved through isolation alone. Resilience is achieved through diversification, flexibility, and access to multiple sources of capability. And in practical terms, that means ensuring that governments and critical institutions can maintain meaningful control of their sensitive systems while preserving access to the most advanced defensive technologies available, which Chris and Nigel have pointed out. It means developing and building architectures that can adapt as technologies change. And it means deepening international cooperation amongst trusted partners, as Mr. Headlee pointed out. And I think one of the strengths of the US and South Korea relationship is that it combines technology leadership, shared security interests, and decades of operational cooperation. And that partnership should not only be used to respond to today's threats, but shape how the countries approach emerging technologies like AI. And ultimately, I think our goal should be straightforward. We should strive for a future in which South Korea can maintain meaningful sovereignty over its most sensitive systems and data, while benefiting from the innovation, scale, and defensive capabilities that come from participation in a broader allied technology ecosystem. And I don't think that those objectives are mutually exclusive. In fact, I think achieving both might be the most important foundation of long-term cyber resilience. And I really look forward to talking about this more with the panelists as we go forward.
Well, thank you all for setting us up for a great conversation. I'll start off with a few questions, but then we will have some time for audience Q&A. So encourage you to start thinking of your questions, and we're grateful that this panel and this event is on the record as well. So just wanted to note that as I forgot to at the start. So starting with one for Nigel, you know, at a very high level, what we're seeing out of the Korean government on cloud, on cyber, on AI sovereignty is really the continuation of a long-running trend. Russ mentioned network usage fees, which I recall you wrote a chapter for us on this 3 years ago. So, you know, this isn't a new set of issues. When you look at the South Korean approach in general, what are the main thrusts and what are the main objectives that you think they're at least attempting to pursue with this approach?
I mean, it's always tricky to try and simplify what drives a government and multiple agencies to do what they do. But I think with Korea, and I mean, we, as a part of an NBR sort of visit last year, had the opportunity to engage with folks from around the Korean government, the US tech sector and elsewhere. Feel I have as good a sense of anyone based here in DC of how the Korean policy environment is going. But a couple of core sort of trends drive out to me, and they're sometimes pulling in different directions. One is obviously protection, in terms of Korea is facing a particularly intense sort of state-sponsored sort of cyber threat environment in its region. I mean, I think the Korean National Intelligence Service noticed that, I think it was something to the effect of like 80% of the volume of cyber security attacks originate from North Korea, and that there's something in the order of like 1.3 or 1.5 million cyber attacks a day. And so that's obviously, when they wake up every morning and go to work, sort of front of mind is protecting themselves against the threats they face. The second is obviously protecting and growing a domestic tech sector that they've obviously designated as strategic. And this is a through line through Korean digital industrial policy, that they want local champions in these designated tech sectors, and that they are happy to enact restrictions sprinkled through laws and regulations to help tilt the field in the locals' favour. And we see this even in more recent policy announcements with the AI Framework Act, which had and the AI strategy, where they have many sort of supportive, innovation-friendly AI measures, but there's still also nearly, of course, sort of data localization elements in there as it relates to personal data and training models for AI. And so that's a continuation. Last but not least is the maintaining regulatory control over data, cloud, models, networks. In that Korea obviously, like every country, wants to maintain sort of regulatory oversight, but there's a fine dividing line when we're talking about it in the context of sovereignty, of like sort of oversight versus control, and what does control look like. And I think these C trends sort of are defensible each and on their own, but it's how are they applied that sort of actually gives us an idea of how well they perform. And I just think that in Korea, again, and it sort of builds on my panelists' thoughts of like, in the current age where you've got to be as close to the frontier as possible, and as many people and organizations as possible have got to be using the frontier, sort of the policy foundation, the state of the art of the policy defines how quickly and adaptably they can do that. And in Korea, we see these restrictions across multiple different sectors and vectors that act as a barrier from them being as adaptive as they need to be as it relates to AI in the context of cybersecurity.
So Chris, for you, kind of from your perch at Google, how important is the ability of companies like Google to operate across borders to the work that you do in both securing Google's own infrastructure, but then also to helping your partners secure their systems?
Sure. Thank you. That's a great question. You know, we are really committed to providing security at global scale. And when you think about how the cloud operates, we really do take advantage of those economies of scale. And that enables us to drive down, for instance, the per unit cost of investments in state-of-the-art tools, post-quantum cryptography, new GPU clusters to power our security operations centers. For instance, and by the way, we just launched a new security operations center in Seoul, and we're very proud of that. One of the advantages of working with a global cloud provider is that we are able to very quickly take new security updates and patches and push them to our global customers instantaneously. And this is really critical at a time when AI is accelerating, not just the sophistication, but the speed at which adversaries are operating, which means that defenders need to keep pace. When you think about the physical isolation requirements, which are our policy, these requirements, essentially what they're doing is imposing friction on implementation and validation of patches. Rather than us being able to push security updates to our customers, these updates have to go through an air gap. They have to be independently tested, validated, implemented. You know, this takes security updates from minutes to hours or days. And when you think about the fact that mean time to exploit new vulnerabilities has dropped from months to hours, this sort of friction is leaving defenders at a competitive disadvantage. And there are all sorts of other security benefits that we can take advantage of by being able to share data across borders. For instance, sharing security telemetry, eliminating the kinds of blind spots that threat actors hide in, informing a global zero trust model in order to be able to very finely limit access to only those data and systems that actors and identities need access to. These are the kinds of global capabilities that we want to bring to the Korean market. And currently, we continue to face regulatory barriers.
All right. And then for Caitlin, I want you to kind of put your government and your policy experience hat on, hearing what Chris has said, hearing what Nigel has said about kind of the Korean context. How would you go about dealing with this from a policy perspective? What specific measures could help achieve the goals that Nigel mentioned as it relates to security and protection of sensitive data while freeing up the private sector to do what it does best?
So I have had both experience doing cybersecurity in the private sector as well as cybersecurity in the government context. So I'm kind of one of those people who've seen it on both sides. I think Nigel and Chris have both kind of touched on what my recommendation to governments would be. I mean, Nigel highlighted a little bit of the threat context in which South Korea is operating. I'm going to just enumerate that a little bit more. I will be the person to say it. We have North Korea targeting not only South Korea, but across the globe to raise money for the government. We have PRC-aligned threat actors targeting both government systems and critical infrastructure systems. And we still have my favorite people that I deal with on a day-to-day basis, cyber criminals who are increasingly adopting the tools that Chris talked about to be able to speed their exploit, to get into companies and hold them at risk. And all of those things are happening at once. And when I was in my former roles, one of the three things that I really needed to respond and be effective is one, visibility. Government needs to have visibility into all of those threats we just talked about. That comes from things like Chris's point on the ability to identify threats early, to have access to large scale threat intelligence, that telemetry that is happening around the globe, that is identifying the actors, tactic, techniques, and procedures. If you're only seeing one slice of the threat, you're not seeing the full picture and you're leaving yourself at further risk. Second, government needs agility. So when I was in private sector, one of my roles I had was I was the person who responded to all cyber regulatory exams. And let me tell you how much fun that was, answering questions about cybersecurity programs for governments around the world. And every time you would get a questionnaire, it was somewhat bespoke for that particular country, and you had to answer hundreds of questions about how, as a global company, you did cybersecurity. Well, that approach is kind of grounded in the threats of yesterday. That approach of, we need to ask about certain controls. We need to ask about how data is being protected in a very specific way. That doesn't give that agility and that flexibility to allow governments to adapt their systems for the threats and the technologies as they evolve. Like, we are honestly sometimes fighting the threats of 10 years ago with our approaches. And guess what? As technology evolves, regulation needs to evolve. We cannot be regulating for the threats of 10 years ago. And then lastly, we just need deeper cooperation. The threats I talk about impacting South Korea are also impacting the United States. They're impacting Australia. What really drives government network protection and improvements is the deep learning that happens when governments talk to each other about this, when they have open dialogue, when they have intelligence sharing, joint exercises, the coordinated incident response. Because what I'm seeing in the US, I guarantee you it's being seen in South Korea. And we need to deepen those relationships. And, it is, you will probably play the game with me. I will say the word flexibility multiple times, because that's really what is necessary to be able to manage the risks as this technology is evolving, while also adapting to the threat environment. You cannot be static. You cannot be focused on the threats of the past.
All right, and then one more question for all of you before we open it up to the audience. Obviously, as Russ mentioned, sovereignty is an increasingly big topic, and you can put any number of words in front of it: AI, digital, data, etc. And you've seen particular interest in the AI sovereignty piece from Korea, also from others, but a lot from Korea. How do you view kind of this conception of sovereignty in the context of the US-ROK tech relationship and kind of the fundamental importance of the tech partnership to both countries?
I think Russ did a good job of focusing on it, and having been in many heated debates about prior waves of sovereignty, like it's a challenging debate to be in because it matters on specifics. And I think to Russ's point, like what matters is the capabilities involved, the capacities involved, and what's the underlying driving motivation. I feel there's a tendency with where we are with the age of AI, there's a tendency by political leaders when something in and around AI happens for them to pull the sovereignty debate into the far end of the spectrum as it's defined through full control of data, people, full ownership, infrastructure, the full kit and caboodle. And given the nature of globally distributed and developed technologies, that's essentially a fallacy, and it's self-defeating. And what I've been saying with policymakers, my phrase for it is enlightened sovereignty, in terms of the hybrid approach of leveraging global technologies and partners, infrastructure, obviously complementing it with local infrastructure, local capabilities, local partnerships, so that countries are able to get the most out of technologies, while in a very specific and narrowly targeted way, where there are sensitivities, sensitive workloads and data, you enact additional controls in and around that, while still maintaining broad access to cutting edge technologies. And we've seen that play out through the service offerings that Google's and other can provide, in able to providing additional higher levels of control in the deployment and use of AI. And in this same context, like I'm grounded by past precedent in how cloud certifications have evolved in developed economies around the world, in that they enact greater numbers of controls depending on the risk nature of the workload. And that's what I think will eventually where we'll get to with AI. For those truly sensitive workloads, there will be service offerings that they can have with air gap services and such that still allows them to use global models. There's just additional controls, legal, admin, technical around how they do that, so that they have a greater level of oversight. I think the natural tendency of policymakers to be drawn to the full control stack is just counterproductive. And I mean, I think in the Korean context or any country's context, like the reaction to a supply chain risk is not to concentrate it correspondingly in a single point of a single stack. So a Korea AI stack, which itself in any country is going to be built on a very narrow technology base. So if anything happens to that stack, the consequences are going to be quite dire. Which gets back to my final point in the debate around sovereignty. What is often unrecognised are the trade-offs involved, depending on what you're talking about. And given how critical AI is to cybersecurity, but just also innovation and economic development, like those trade-offs are going to be pretty severe. And policymakers don't like to admit that when they have this debate. They feel they could have it all. Whereas that just doesn't reflect the practical reality of where we're at with technologies like AI. I'll leave it at that.
I like to say that security and sovereignty are two sides of the same coin. You can't be secure if you don't have control over your data or the means of encryption. But at the same time, you can't be fully sovereign if the measures you take to wall off your infrastructure from external threats actually leave your data at greater risk of loss or theft. We've really strived to meet customers where they are around the world. And we think it's critical to provide governments and enterprises around the world choice in the kind of infrastructure they're using, the kinds of sovereign encryption tools that they can take advantage of to control their data, as well as choice in the kinds of models that they want to use, right? We don't force our customers to use our own Gemini models. We keep an open approach. You can use our models, you can use third-party models, you can use open models. And we think this is really critical. But at the same time, as Nigel said, there are trade-offs. And we think it's important to give customers the choice to make those risk decisions based on their business needs, their risk appetite, their regulatory landscape. But if the regulation is steering customers into a choice they don't want to make, it's going to be problematic and it's going to be detrimental for security. So, we look forward to continuing these discussions, and we think this conversation is really critical and really critical at this time.
I'm just going to go back to what I said in my opening remarks. Like it makes sense of why governments would want to have, as we've already talked about, control over sensitive data and over some really critical functions. But by limiting decisions around what technology can support that, you're actually increasing risk and potentially lessening the resilience of the government and of the critical services to the threats that they may face. Like the thought that we can prevent everything does not work. We cannot do that. I wish that I could. I have 3 kids. I would like to prevent a lot of things from happening. I can't do that. What I can do is be able to bounce back and be able to operate through. And that comes through choice, through the ability to access best-in-class technologies, which are not defined by location, but are defined by capability. And I just kind of go back to that. If we're really looking for a security outcome, then we need to focus on the capabilities we need, which don't really have a geographic definition for it. It's about where can we access the best-in-class capabilities and technologies to support the security outcomes we're seeking to achieve.
With that, I'll go ahead and open it up for audience questions. One of my colleagues will have a mic, so if you could just raise your hand, identify yourself, and keep your questions brief and in the form of a question. We'll start off with Tammy here, once we can get a mic over to you.
Thank you, Tammy Overby with DGA. Thank you, Senior Official Headlee, for telling us what the U.S. government, where y'all are thinking. It's very helpful and great panelists. Given what we've seen come out of Ukraine war and how data centers become military targets, and I understand Google and some of your competitors provided some help to Ukraine before the bombing began, and how it really saved Ukraine's infrastructure. So comments on that. And the second thing is, last October, Korea had a horrible fire in their national data center. 8 terabytes of Korean public sector data gone. How does that sort of play into what advice y'all are giving? And again, this is excellent. Thanks, NBR.
I'm happy to start, but I'm sure others will have perspectives here. I mean, I think those are 2 really textbook examples as to why you need a globally distributed, globally resilient infrastructure presence. We were proud to support the Ukrainian government on the ground. I was part of our Ukraine task force back in 2022. They actually had a law on the books requiring localization of data in Ukraine. And based on emergency decree, they flexed that capability because they understood that infrastructure would become a target. Just as a little aside, one thing we started to hear in spring of 2022 is that Ukrainian government officials had all started to use their personal Gmails, and that's because their data centers had been destroyed, and it's the most secure and resilient way to communicate is via Gmail. And so we worked with the Ukrainian government. We set them up on enterprise-grade workspace with security monitoring and malware protection. But I think it really underscores the value of the global cloud as a net promoter of resilience and security. I think it's great to be able to rely on these examples.
I think this is a perfect example of what I was talking about having choice and multiple providers providing resilience, right? Because even in the Ukraine situation, it wasn't just Google supporting, it was multiple technology providers providing that data backup that allowed critical infrastructure and government services to operate through the conflict and the war. And I think when you talk about a fire in a specific location, sorry, that's bringing me back to my FEMA days of like all the data is in one location, but that's exactly why standards and approaches and best practices have been, you don't store everything in one spot because that becomes an easy target. You don't have one vendor who does one thing for your company, because we have seen what happens with a single disruptive cyber attack against one vendor, taking out an entire industry segment because everybody relies on the exact same provider. So this is where I'm talking about diversification and choice actually builds resilience. I think sometimes we think if we harden enough, we're resilient. I can tell you how many times there's it's been human error that has caused things to go awry. And when you concentrate that all, concentration risk is also a risk. And I think that's one of the things we need to think about when it comes to cloud and AI and resilience, is all of that comes together.
I think Korea, all of the points about Korea has built a considerable cost and risk cloud cybersecurity framework that the rest of the world has spent the last decade moving away from. And that's, the rest of the world has moved away from that because of these acute risks of concentration and the ability to leverage globally distributed services, which provide the failovers, so that an incident in one doesn't mean you really lose much of anything. And the Ukraine case is one. There was a data center hit in the UAE that provides another. And then the fire in Korea that, should make it very clear to Korean policymakers the risks of concentrating data and services in a single data center, which then has a fire, especially given its obviously tense relationship with North Korea. Concentrating your data in Korea when you have access to global cloud providers seems a giant risk. And just as way of background for those folks that aren't as steeped in this as I unfortunately have to be, but Korea maintains essentially architectural exclusion for foreign cloud providers in its public cloud cybersecurity framework, known as CSAP, which is shifting to be governed, administered by the Korean National Intelligence Service. At the moment, foreign providers are precluded from serving moderate and high workloads in the Korean public sector, in no small part due to physical separation requirements in terms of how foreign providers have to run completely physical separate operations to service those potential clients, whereas obviously in the rest of the world they use multi-tenant architecture. And Korea really is unique in doing that, and having looked and assessed all certifications across the US FedRAMP system, Canada's system, Japan's ISMAP, CSAP, and Australia, the vast majority of public cloud services are in the moderate level and up. And all of these other developed economies have cloud cybersecurity regimes that allow foreign providers in place. Korea does not. And so, this physical separation requirement and complemented by data localization and other restrictions extends into the financial services sector and other areas. And so Korea is facing a scenario where there's obviously growing AI-driven risks, and they have legal and regulatory barriers in place that preclude them from actually accessing the tools that would best enable them to defend themselves.
If I can just add on to that, and I'm glad that you mentioned the financial regulations, the FSC, because we've seen in recent weeks that FSC has relaxed some of those regulations in order to bring in cloud-based AI services like frontier models for deep scanning. You know, this is occurring at a time when the trend is moving in the opposite direction worldwide, and this is a really pragmatic move, and you know, something worth calling attention to.
And I mean, just to build on that, it exposes broader Korean cloud restrictions to greater cybersecurity risks, because the Korean financial regulatory authorities have realized that to protect the financial services sector, critical infrastructure sector, they need to relax this requirement so that they can access best-in-class AI models. That same assessment applies to Korea's public cloud sort of a cybersecurity regime.
Yeah.
And so we potentially face a scenario in 6 or 12 months' time where Korean banks can access whatever model they want from wherever they want, whereas Korean government agencies, hospitals, schools, and others won't be able to do the same. And so that's going to obviously lead to differential sort of cybersecurity risks.
But it also leads to, those are the sectors you just talked about are often the sectors that are, this is going to be terrible for me to say, target rich, resource poor. That there is data in those sectors, in education and in healthcare, that is very valuable to threat actors. And at a time when we know that they have tools that allow them to potentially gain entry and exploits faster, having that wider gap in cybersecurity is actually just potentially putting a bigger bullseye on those sectors that don't have the ability to gain access to the best-in-class frontier models to help them. You know, we talk about the threat actors being able to use the AI models potentially to develop exploits, but I don't think I've harped enough, or Chris and I have not harped enough on the fact that AI can really help those sectors that are under-resourced bolster their cyber defenses, because it identifies and can help patch and can help, you know, detect threat activity so much faster in those sectors where we know, I'm going to go back to my favorite criminal gangs, they like to hit because the data is so rich.
So the bullseye on a huge chunk of Korea's public sector is bigger, and apparently the financial services have got the memo and they're moving in the right direction. But the rest of the Korean public sector has a bigger bullseye. And
I wouldn't say it's necessarily bigger bullseye. Those sectors are already targeted globally. I would just point out that they are not having the benefit of the modern defenses that are available.
well, they've got neighbors who,
Yes, exactly.
Sorry.
I was being more of the ransomware gangs. Yes.
Hi, I'm Jun Kim. I'm a correspondent from the Joseon Daily, South Korean newspaper. I have a question about that you reform on the cloud security certification framework consultation under NIS. From a cloud security provider's view, how are you guys like speaking up on that issue? Do you think it's a progress in terms of making up a level playing field? I know there's been a long history of like Google, AWS getting into the public sector market in South Korea. And another question is like, so has this issue been discussed as part of like the trade agenda between two countries? Like, is there any, to any of you, do you think is there any potential for this to disrupt things, bilateral constitutions, as what we have seen with Kupang?
So in terms of the reforms of CSAP, we are monitoring the reforms underway as it's being centralized under the National Intelligence Service. My counterparts in Seoul are actively working with the government to provide input, share some of the same things that I've shared with you today directly to the government. I think on the one hand, it's good to streamline the process that's underway. However, impediments remain around the physical infrastructure isolation requirement, around very strict data residency requirements. We are very devoted, committed to the Korean market. We're making investments there. We still see, impediments for U.S. providers trying to serve that market, and so we'll continue to try to make headway. In terms of broader U.S. Korea trade conversations, I don't know. Russ is in the room. Maybe that's a good question for him. But we'll continue the conversation, and we're eager to partner with the Korean government.
I'll just add there, the Korea's physical separation requirement, data localization, use of local encryption, and other restrictions have long been a priority, a target for US trade negotiators. That remains the same now. The fact that one of the counterpoints you'll get from Korean policymakers in making the case for them to reform CSAP's requirements is that this is a national security issue and thus non-negotiable. That did not stand on its own legs then, and clearly does not stand on its own legs now, especially given what the Korean Financial Services Commission has decided to do. And I think the discriminatory nature of it is unclear when you contrast it, again, what I said, to how Japan, the US, Canada, and Australia manage cloud cybersecurity frameworks. And that at the moment, just to say it out loud, and this is from a forthcoming National Bureau of Asian Research piece, US cloud providers only hold CSAP certifications at the low tier within Group C services, which is like local government and very specific services, and only for infrastructure as a service, and have yet to win a public sector contract, even at the low tier. Meanwhile, US cloud providers play a leading role in pretty much every other developed economy's cloud certification regime. And so it's just very stark on its face, like what this actually means from a cybersecurity perspective, but also from a trade and technology perspective. And that's hopefully what negotiators will be able to square the circle on in ongoing talks.
I believe there's language in the joint text of last November that says both governments agree that they will not discriminate against US tech providers, and it's kind of hard to match all that.
Yes, please.
Hi there, Caroline Palmer with CCIA. Thanks very much for this panel. It's been really helpful. My question is for Caitlin primarily, but I'll open it to the rest of the panel as well, if you have any thoughts. But you mentioned your experience working in the private sector, having to kind of answer many varying questions depending on which country was asking. I'd imagine, Chris, you probably have a similar experience as well. I know we have, ISO, NIST, but countries are continually adding new and different requirements. So do you think there's a realistic path forward towards some sort of common international baseline for cybersecurity standards to reduce friction? Or do you think that national security concerns and different threat environments are too significant for any kind of meaningful change? And I'll also add, if you think harmonization is possible, what kinds of fora or organizations do you think would be the most helpful to run in?
So I do think, for many years, regulatory harmonization, I feel like, has been a buzzword without a lot of action towards achieving any of the outcomes. of actually aligning on cybersecurity standards and regulations. I do think, however, there is appetite to really look hard at, let's do this for real. There's been pockets of goodness in harmonizing cybersecurity regulations and standards, namely around Internet of Things devices, where we have seen Japan and Singapore, really look at mutual recognition of labeling of IoT devices. We saw the US and the EU try to align on the US Cyber Trust Mark and where the EU was going on IoT devices. We should not have pockets of good. I don't think we want pockets of goodness. I think we want to look at the full spectrum of how we address cybersecurity regulations and standards. I think we're still trying to figure out where the best body is to handle that. But some of the things that has been brought up is, if you are to develop something bespoke, try to justify why you didn't use an existing standard, right? Why you didn't use NIST or ISO, and why you had to do something different. Right now, nobody explains that. It just shows up as something different. So as a first step, perhaps it could be, looking at why an existing standard was not used in a space and why something was more bespoke. I think that there's a lot of work left to do in this space. A lot of organizations and countries and companies all want to actually tackle this problem. We're still trying to figure out where to do it, what the best forum to do this is, and really what the first step is. Because we've been talking about it for years. I was in private sector in the financial services when this was first brought up, and my child was in daycare. My child is now in middle school. That's how long this conversation has happened, and we have not really made meaningful strides towards that.
Yeah, I mean, regulatory harmonization it's a really hard problem, and they've been discussing this at the OECD for a long time. I've been tackling this at least as long as I've been at Google. It's a hard problem. It's a collective action problem, because at some point, you want everyone to align around your regulation, right? You don't really want to compromise yours. You want everybody to do. So it is a hard problem. I will say that I am heartened by recent conversations we've had in the UK and otherwise with their cyber resilience bill, trying to find ways to align some of its provisions with existing regulation, for instance, NIS2 in Europe. I think there's a recognition that there is, a concern about fragmentation and compliance fatigue at the cost of real security. We're still having that conversation about incident reporting in the US. I'll spare you that digression, but we're happy to collaborate as that takes shape.
Final, last but not least, I love this topic. I've written an extensive report on trying to define cloud trustworthiness, which obviously standards play a core role. I love standards. Standards are at the foundation of everything we try and do. It's just really interesting in the cloud perspective. I mean, what NIST has done is widely used with their special publication 800-53. But there's obviously much more to do from a technical standards perspective, but there's also a political element on top of this in terms of how we go about with cloud trustworthiness. But there's ways that countries can and do square the circle on this. Germany's IT Act recognises if a cloud provider is from a NATO country, that is a tick in the trustworthiness box. There's nothing to stop the US and Korea doing similar, given their extensive intelligence and defence partnerships there. And that I take light of the Antipodean approach to this, in that there is mutual recognition between New Zealand and Australian cybersecurity authority as it relates to their cybersecurity assessments. So this is possible. And last but not least, I take light from the growing public advisories that Five Eyes countries put out from a cybersecurity perspective. Their most recent was from yesterday or 2 days ago.
Yesterday.
Literally on everything we've spoken about in terms of AI and security. And they are so clued up there. If we can perhaps broaden the base of that discussion out into the cloud cybersecurity and AI certification regime, like we could start to figure out what forum, what vehicle can we work together on these types of issues.
All right. We have time for one more question. If anyone in the audience, oh, there's one over here.
Hello, my name is Jacob Tanazi. I'm a fellow with Silverado Policy Accelerator. Thank you guys for being here and chatting with us today. Something that I would love if you guys could expand on is something that you all have kind of touched on, is that when it comes to talking about sovereignty, I think there's often an element of trying to protect and grow local capacity. And so I was wondering if you guys had any insight for how either the public or private sectors could be able to increase the local capacity in Korea while still fostering those international partnerships and making sure that the regulatory environment is sound.
Sure. So I can start. I think where we have approached this problem or challenge in other geographies is that, again, we really focus on choice, enabling customers to choose the infrastructure, choose the models that are right for their business needs. But when we enter a new market, we are also providing the infrastructure that the startups and the technology, the innovation ecosystem needs to grow organically. And so a lot of what we'll do is we'll engage founders, we'll engage application developers, show them how they can use our product, provide them training opportunities to get skilled on our tools, our cybersecurity tools, our AI tools. We also invest really heavily in some of these local partnerships, whereby we are actually training their engineers on how to use our tools, which from a technology standpoint, like these are very attractive jobs because it creates the foundation for a career in IT. And then it's also really important that we're not just like providing foundational infrastructure, that we're partnering with universities, research institutes, provide a career path for students, but we're also training our models on local data sets, local languages, trying to provide greater cultural fidelity as we enter a new market. And one example is our partnership with the Singaporean government on a program called Sea Lion, right? Our approach is to really bring the tools to the local tech ecosystem and the local community so they can explore and create.
The one thing I'll add to that, and the Sea Lion is a great example of like global partnership, local capabilities and connections. And now this Sea Lion model of Southeast Asian languages can be used globally because it's hosted on global hyperscalers. The one thing I would add in addition to the sort of the local partnerships aspect is like governments taking proactive steps to encourage adoption, and where cost is often the first barrier, providing tax and other incentives to local developers and firms and such that allow them to get their foot in the door, realize what's at stake, and take that first step to adopting and deploying sort of cutting edge technologies. We see that in Singapore and in other countries. I think that's a critical part of the toolkit, and goes to my point of like that to maximize the impact of these new technologies comes from the vast majority of the benefit comes from their deployment and use rather than their actual initial development. And that's proven through every major general purpose technology. And so if countries can take a step, whether it's tax or financial or other incentives to help them improve and broaden adoption, then they're on the right track.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to join us today. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for their insightful remarks. Really, not just Nigel's forthcoming paper, but it's really touched on a number of issues that we cover regularly in our research and policy engagement. So encourage you to stay tuned to NBR's work on these topics and look forward to seeing you all in the future. But until then, thank you all for coming.